The Byzantines were the direct descendants of the greatest power the Mediterranean had seen in 1,000 years. In their own times, they referred to themselves simply as the Romans, and were the ones who boldly carried its banner into the Middle Ages. Their military was easily as glorious as their ancestors, and is well worth discussing. However, in this new era, swords could not solve every problem. New solutions were required to meet the challenges of the day. The projection of soft power through diplomacy was one such tool, which all too often goes overlooked. After all, while it was often more subtle, its effects could often be just as impactful as any victory in the field. Today, we will seek to shed light on this matter by discussing the use of shock and awe tactics in the Byzantine court. If you're like me and love to look at these under-the-hood mechanics of the ancient world, I think you'll enjoy the Royal Court expansion for Crusader Kings 3 from our sponsor Paradox. While the base game itself does a great job bringing the rich intricacies of medieval geopolitics to life, this edition brings everything to a whole new level by creating a fully immersive 3D throne room. Here you can customize the hall with great symbols of your glory, be it commissioned artwork, priceless relics, or heaps of your well-earned treasure. Surrounded by these trophies, you can be ready to wow ambassadors, pass judgment on royal audiences, and watch the drama of the court play out. The new cultural system has also been overhauled to add greater dynamism to the campaign. New traditions, divergence features, hybridization, and more let you truly craft a rich experience that reflects the true nature of the medieval world. You can get Crusader Kings 3 and try out the Royal Court yourself today by clicking the link in the description below. Enjoy! The Byzantines faced many new threats to their power in the years of the dawning Middle Ages. Naming and ranking them all will be impossible. That being said, we can offer a quick rundown of the medieval tier list from the perspective of Constantinople. Naturally, they would have begun by placing themselves at the very top of the pile. After all, they were the preservers of the Roman tradition, which brought with it centuries of accumulated legitimacy and grandeur. In the mind of the Byzantines, they were the only S-tier civilization, and no one else could compare. To their eyes, the closest anyone might get would be the various ancient powers of the East. Its Parthian and later Sassanid rulers had long established their roots of legitimacy and proved themselves capable challengers to Rome. The Arab conquests of the 7th century AD brought new banners and new faith to the land, but would take up the torch of the old East-West rivalry. To this end, the new caliphs proved even more expansionist than their predecessors, and quickly cemented their role as a direct rival, pressuring the emperors militarily, economically, and politically. Over the centuries, a complicated relationship was formed, in which both sides became inextricably linked in a geopolitical tug-of-war. Though Byzantine propaganda always positioned itself as the unquestioned master of the relationship, their actions betray a begrudging recognition of the high stature of their eastern rivals. But if the caliphs were to be treated as A or B tier neighbors, then the various barbarian chiefs of the West were to be treated as F tier. After all, these were the petty kings who played with toy crowns amidst the ashes of a ruined Western Empire. It was only through the amassing of great armies and territory that they were ever able to receive a degree of recognition from the Byzantines. Yet even then, there was a glass ceiling to their ascent. Any who grew too powerful were framed by imperial propaganda as mere rebels in revolt against the legal claim of the emperor to the western provinces, while those who dared to crown themselves as Roman emperors were branded as blasphemers and worse. With this in mind, we can turn our attention to key examples of how Byzantine court politics dealt with these different tiers of rivals. First, we'll discuss how the imperial court was a reflection of their perceived S-tier rank, and how it adopted distinctly different approaches to its eastern and western neighbors. As previously stated, much of the Roman Empire's prestige came from its longevity. Such permanence bred stability and a basis for common development of civilizations. Following the traditional fall of the West, many governments would build themselves upon its example. This was certainly the case with the imperial court of Constantinople, which by the 11th century was a truly ancient and venerable institution. Officials held titles like magistros, domesticos, and quaestor for over 800 years. The origins of some titles even stretched all the way back to the days of the Roman Republic. However, the true bureaucratic nature of this court and its offices were descended from the administrative reforms of Diocletian in the 3rd century AD and the religious reforms of Constantine in the 4th. While at first all positions had a well-defined purpose, over the years this was less and less the case. With such age and pedigree came ceremony, and with such ceremony came a plethora of titles and useless offices. In total, there were at least 82 of these, each with their own lengthy honorifics and all. Let's review a few to give you a sense of what we're talking about. Ostensibly, the offices were structured as follows. The Basileus Kai Autokrator was the head of the state and the representative of the Christian god. Below him was the Kaiser, the title given to the heir apparent who often acted as co-emperor. Next to the Kaiser was the Despotes, which was an imperial title that had existed since Justinian and later supplanted Kaiser as the title for the imperial heir. Besides them was the Sebastocrator, which literally translates to august ruler. This person was typically a preeminent member of the imperial family who was not in the direct line of succession, likely a brother or an uncle. Below these are the more plebeian ranks, which were shuffled and shifted over the centuries. The Great Dukes and the Grand Domestics were the medieval equivalent of the Roman Admiral of the fleet and the Roman Master of soldiers, and answered directly to the imperial family. Traditionally, there were 2 Grand Domestics, each in supreme command of the eastern and western armies. From there, the order of precedence and rank becomes complicated. Some might even say that the order of offices is Byzantine in its complexity. Among these, there were the more translatable titles like the Grand Chamberlain of the Palace, the Master of the Wardrobe and Treasury, and the Master of the Companions. Beyond this, we start to get into bizarre and ill-defined positions. For instance, the Panhuper Sebastos can be comically translated as the super extra special boy, while the Huper Proto Sebastos Huper Tatos can be read as the very super extra special boy. Suffice to say, there were a ton of these ridiculous sounding positions that seem like straight up satire. Yet while they might appear functionally useless to a modern observer, they did indeed have a practical purpose. For one, they likely carried with them duties and benefits which are otherwise unknown to us. These perks, along with the bragging rights, would in turn have allowed the emperor to dole out favors to his followers. The bureaucracy also created a controlled arena in which there might be a competition for honors among the elites who might otherwise revolt against the total dictatorship of the emperor. We find similar mind games at play in the imperial courts of later France and Japan, which speaks to the utility of this strategy. In addition, the sheer number of offices and their pomposity helped flaunt the might of the Byzantines. Of course they were powerful. Just look at the glorious heritage of their ancestral titles. Look at the length of the honorifics attached to even the most lowly of their ranks. Look at the sheer number of great men who attend the court. All of this together helped cultivate a sense that the Byzantines were simply better than you. Now, let us turn to an example of how they used this concept against Eastern visitors. We can begin with the remarks of Constantine VII the Purple-Born in his book De Ceremoniis, regarding the ceremonial protocol at the court of the Byzantine emperors. He states, quote, "If imperial power is displayed with order and dignity, and so reproduces the harmonious movements given by God to the universe, then it will induce the admiration of foreigners, and will seem to our own subjects more pleasant and more impressive." This could be achieved by many means, such as the great bureaucracy we previously mentioned. However, it often involved the deployment of a wide arsenal of tactics meant to exude magnificence. We see this come to great heights in the pissing contest that evolved between the Byzantines and the Abbasids, who were constantly trying to one-up one another. Records tell of how months would be spent in preparation for the coming of ambassadors to wow them with the cleanliness, the lavishness, and the wealth of host cities. No expenses would be spared, and we even hear amusing tales of how expensive vases might accidentally be broken in front of visitors just to show how little such items meant to them. One particularly petty back and forth involved a visit by John the Grammarian to the court of Al-Mamun in 830 AD. Baghdad put on quite the show, but apparently the grizzled diplomat showed little reaction, focusing instead on collecting notes about the palace in which he was being entertained. Upon his return to Constantinople, the floor plan of the Abbasid palace was handed to the emperor, who built a replica for his own amusement in Bithynia. The meaning behind such a power move was clear. The Abbasid court was but a playground for him in his vacation time. Meanwhile, it proved quite difficult for anyone to match the magnificence of Constantinople. This was the true secret weapon of the Byzantine strategy of shock and awe diplomacy. In this matter, all the city was a stage. This began with the imposing triple walls of Constantinople, which greeted any foreign delegation. Once inside, they would be carefully led along the wide roads leading through the city to the great dome skyline in the distance. Here they would pass the rich shops, bustling ports, triumphal monuments, and all manner of architectural feats of wonder. The people too would be on display, with an enormous population that swarmed like a sea, but was parted by lictors with whips who manifest their respect for imperial authority. As the visitors were made to walk through this carefully choreographed approach, they would finally arrive at the centerpiece of the Chrysotriklinos, the golden audience hall of the emperors. Originally built by Emperor Justin II and his successor Tiberius II in the 6th century AD, it had most recently been refurbished in the 9th century by Basil I. Unfortunately, the location and exact design of the palace are lost to us. From what we do know, however, the palace was centered around a dome supported by 8 great arches. The easternmost end of the chamber held the emperor's golden throne placed behind bronze rails. It was lit naturally from above by 16 windows carefully cut into the dome overhead. The northeast chamber, known as St. Theodore's Oratory, held the imperial crown as well as the rod of Moses, both potent symbols of Byzantine dominance over the empire and over Christianity as a whole. This is also where the emperor would be robed before he appeared in the state to see ambassadors and petitioners. To the south were the great silver doors that led to the private chambers of the emperor. The Chrysotriklinos also held the imperial treasury, at least in part, as well as an undescribed chamber known as the Pantheon. On the floors and walls, meanwhile, were great mosaic designs. Directly above the emperor, Christ looked down from his eastern seat high in the arches, and across from him was a great mosaic of Mary, the Mother of God, the patron saint of the capital. Constantine the Purple also added floral pieces throughout the structure, both in mosaic and actual flowers. Everything was designed to make the petitioner feel insignificant, just another speck of sand falling through the eternal hourglass of the Roman Empire. This was the chamber where the emperor's procession gathered in the mornings to travel across the city to the Hagia Sophia every day. Yet this was no mere transitory chamber, barren but for a few functionaries and the emperor himself. Rather, it was a parade ground for the pride of the Byzantines. For instance, flanking the throne was a line of men known as the conditoi, whose sole job it was to hold on display scepters and relics while the emperor held court. State banquets were also held in this great hall, forever reminding the visitors of the wealth and power of the Byzantine Empire. It is this room which would serve as the climax of most ambassadorial visits. I will now quote directly from a source describing one such visit by the Abbasids, which helps illustrate the shock and awe tactics deployed by the Byzantines against their guests. Quote, "The conditoi stood to either side in the hall, and the scaramangia wearing the insignia of the conditoi, and behind the conditoi to either side of the hall stood the mandatores of the arithmos with swords and shields. The oarsmen of the imperial dramon stood to either side in the hall of the conditoi, facing the church of the Lord. Oarsmen also stood at the hall, where the baldachin is, and where the magistroi are appointed, and at the onopodion as well. Beyond them, at the portico of the hall of Augustiosus, that is, at the gold hand, stood the archon's sons, and the valets of the emperor's vestiarion, and the stewards of the table, the archon's sons wearing the scaramangia and swords, the valets wearing dark-colored chlamyces, and the stewards of the table wearing short-sleeved tunics of sham reddish purple." He goes on, stating that thus the two ambassadors were made to walk past endless ranks of noblemen, guards, eunuchs, and every other person of note in the imperial palace. Our source goes on, quote, "The Saracen guests conducted by the Catapano of the emperor's men and the comies of the stable went through the pergola and the hall of the conditoi, and the hall where the baldachin is, and where the magistroi are appointed, and from there through the onopodion and the portico of the hall of Augustios, and sat there until the emperor went into the sacred palace. After the entry of the emperor into the palace, the Saracen guests were summoned after a long wait, and from the hall of the Augustios they went through the internal passageways of the Augustios and the apse of the covered hippodrome, and from there they went through as far as the Scaila. They went in and sat on the western side of the hall of Justinian on the benches there. Then tailored tunics and the rest of their ceremonial dress was sent to them by the emperor through one of the staff of the bedchamber." The source goes on, but basically, from there they were conducted into the hall of the Chrysotriklinos itself, and there they were met with a golden table surrounded by golden couches. Behind these couches, yet more conditoi stood along the walls, each bearing a different golden scepter or relic. And after this banquet, the ambassadors were lavished in gifts, which, as Constantine the Purple-born describes, quote, "Before the departure of the guests, 500 silver coins on gold plates decorated with precious stones were given to each of the two guests through the steward of the table, and 3,000 silver coins to the rest of the men." Given all this, it's hard to imagine just how an ambassador could remain unfazed by such dazzling displays of wealth. In this case, the shock and awe tactics were carefully planned as a way to influence the perception of the Byzantine strength, just as negotiations were set to begin regarding peace talks and the exchange of prisoners between the Abbasid Caliph and the Emperor. Thus we see how soft power could be just as powerful a bargaining tool as the mobilization of military forces. And yet we must note that this was the song and dance that the Byzantines chose to employ against the people that they considered at least close to their level of prestige. When barbarians from the west came calling, they were met with a very different reception. This will best be made evident by the story of Liutprand, who made his own journey to Constantinople just a few years after the Abbasid delegation had arrived. Liutprand of Cremona was an ambassador dispatched from the court of Otto II of the Holy Roman Empire to discuss a marriage alliance between East and West. Prior to this delegation, the dubiously named Holy Roman Empire had made a vigorous attempt to take control of Byzantine Italy, seizing the ancient city of Rome and its surroundings. At the outset of their mission, Otto II and Liutprand viewed themselves as negotiating from a position of strength and moral superiority. However, the Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros II saw them as nothing more than a toddler which had gotten its hands on a crossbow. Sure, they might be dangerous, but for them to even think of coming to him as equals was an insult to his rule. A very special reception was thus planned to meet their arrival. Our story then begins several months later, in the pouring rain as a delegation of mounted men sat drenched outside the walls of Constantinople. For hours and hours, they had called upon the walls, asking to be let in, but to no avail. Eventually, an imperial official arrived and informed them that they could enter the city of the world's desire, but only if they surrendered their horses and approached on foot. Physically lowered to the muddy ground, they were then led to their quarters located at the far end of the town. Freezing and aching, they were met not by the roaring fire and comforts of a palatial estate, but by the frigid embrace of an unfurnished home. Here, they were unceremoniously dropped off and assigned an armed guard to keep an eye on them. These men took no heed of their needs. Instead, they were left in the hands of a warden who extorted them and made their lives a living nightmare. For drink, they were merely handed wine which Liutprand describes as flavored with, quote, plaster, pitch, and resin. After consuming what could more aptly be called poison than beverage, the ambassadors were forced to sleep on the cold stone floor. The next day was filled with yet more mistreatment until they were finally allowed to make their way to see the emperor. Once again, though, they were forced to make the long trek across the city to the imperial palaces. Over hill and windy street they marched, with no fanfare or protection to accompany them. Yet even when they had finally arrived at the gates of the palace, more excuses were made. The emperor was simply not available. They must wait for this reason or the other. Oh, he is available now, but first he must speak to his brother, Leo, the marshal of the court and chancellor. This was the man in charge of all letters and requests, and he had the grand title of Kuropalates, and so surely he must be able to help. Nope. More delaying tactics were deployed, with a frustrated Liutprand ultimately asking if a deal could be worked out, or if he should simply just give up and head home. The torture, though, had only just begun, and no definitive answer was given. Suspended in this limbo, the hours slowly ticked by. Finally, the summons came to meet the emperor. Liutprand was justifiably furious, and writes quite the scathing and clearly exaggerated description of Nikephoros in his account. Quote, "He is a monstrosity of a man, a dwarf, fat-headed with tiny mole's eyes, disfigured by a short, broad, thick beard half gone grey, disgraced by a neck barely an inch long, with pig-like bristles sprouting from his head in color of an Ethiopian, and he has a big belly, a lean butt, short legs and long hips." Clearly, the Byzantine emperor's machinations had gotten to him. Understandably, the ensuing negotiations went poorly. Nikephoros was in no mood to entertain the requests of his inferiors who had dared to claim the imperial title in southern Italy. There would be no marriage and no alliance. Instead, he made his own ridiculous demands as an insult. If Liutprand and his master truly wished to receive what they asked for, then they must withdraw from Italy entirely and cede Ravenna to the Byzantines. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a slap across the face. At this point, Liutprand well understood that he would be getting nothing out of this visit. He therefore asked for permission to return home. But the emperor was nowhere near done toying with him. The request was denied, and the ambassador was confined to his quarters. An enraged and now sick Liutprand would be forced to repeat his demand the next day, but would be denied. He tried again. Denied. The following week? Denied. The week after that? Denied. The following month? Denied. Back and forth he went, from his prison of a house to the palace to beg for release, only to be mocked and debated for sport. Finally, after 120 days, Nicephorus eventually grew tired of his plaything and allowed the man to leave. However, the emperor would have one final laugh at his expense. The day that Liutprand was granted leave of the city, he was also informed that a new law had been passed. Apparently, it now required him to seek imperial permission to bring any silk beyond the walls of Constantinople. This applied not only to the expensive gifts Liutprand had bought for his Emperor Otto II, but also to the prized wardrobe he had brought with him and the very clothes on his back. All must remain. Yet even with this theft of what must have been the modern equivalent of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, Liutprand had had enough. Leaving everything behind, he finally stormed off. Such was his fury that he would go on to write a painstakingly detailed report of all the horrors that had been laid upon his expedition. To this day, it stands as one of our more graphic and lively accounts of Constantinople and the Byzantine Court. I hope that these various stories have given you a glimpse behind the curtain of Byzantine geopolitics. While campaigns and battles are certainly fascinating to cover, we must remember that they were quite rare, and ultimately, many more issues of the day would be fought over in the battlefield of imperial courts. Now, with the latest Royal Court expansion for Crusader Kings 3, you can do just that, and perhaps find your own Liutprand to torture, so be sure to check it out by clicking the link in the description below. A huge thanks to the patrons for funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.